For decades, one question has refused to disappear. Not who the Zodiac was, but why no one was ever able to prove it. No answer, no name. The Zodiac Killer. The final mystery. The Zodiac case is one of the most studied investigations in modern history. There were suspects. There was evidence. There were moments when it felt like the truth was close, but every time the case seemed to move forward, something didn't hold. A name would emerge and then fall apart. A theory would make sense until it didn't. And over time, the case became something else, not just a search for a person, but a search for an answer that never fully came together. For years, the Zodiac investigation moved without a clear direction. There were letters, there were victims, there were fragments of evidence scattered across different scenes, but no single name that could hold all of it together, until one name began to surface more than the others. Arthur Lee Allen. He didn't come from a single piece of evidence. He emerged from a pattern, one that investigators couldn't ignore. He lived in the right area. He matched the general physical description. And more importantly, his behavior raised questions. People who knew him described something unsettling, statements that didn't sit right, moments that felt too close to the crimes. And then, there were the details that seemed almost too specific to dismiss. A Zodiac brand watch, marked with a symbol strikingly similar to the one used in the killer's letters. Interests that aligned, timelines that overlapped. Individually, none of it was enough. But together, it began to form something else, a possibility. For investigators, this was the closest the case had come to a real suspect, not a theory, not a faceless profile, a person. And for the first time, the question shifted. It was no longer, who could the Zodiac be? It became, could it be him? And in that moment, the investigation changed direction. Because when a case that has lived in uncertainty for years finally points toward a name, it doesn't just create hope, it creates belief. A belief that the mystery is about to end. But the closer investigators looked, the more the certainty began to fade. Arthur Lee Allen had become the center of the case, the name that seemed to bring everything together. But a name alone was never enough, because in a case like this, everything depended on proof. And that proof never fully arrived. There were handwriting comparisons, one of the most critical pieces in a case defined by letters. Experts examined the Zodiac messages. They compared them to Allen's writing. But the results were not what investigators hoped for. The handwriting did not match, not in a way that could confirm anything. Then came the fingerprints. Partial prints recovered from Zodiac letters and crime scenes were tested, compared, analyzed again and again, and once more, no definitive match. Years later, DNA testing would enter the investigation, a new possibility, a new kind of answer. But even that failed to provide certainty. No clear connection, no confirmation that Arthur Lee Allen was the man behind the name. And slowly, the picture began to shift. Because the man who looked right did not fit the evidence, not completely, not in the way a case like this required. Investigators were left with something difficult to accept. Their strongest suspect was also their weakest conclusion. And the closer they tried to get to the truth, the further it seemed to move away. If Arthur Lee Allen was not the answer, then the investigation had to face something far more complicated. There wasn't just one possibility. There were others, names that had appeared over the years, some quietly, some with growing attention. Each one brought forward as a potential explanation, each one at some point believed to be the missing piece. One of them was Lawrence Kane, a man whose background and behavior raised concerns. He lived in the region. He had a history that, to some investigators, felt relevant. There were claims that placed him close to certain events, close enough to be considered. But once again, nothing definitive, no evidence that could firmly connect him to the letters, no proof that could move suspicion into certainty. Another name was Rick Marshall, a projectionist with an interest in film and symbolism. Some believed his knowledge and personality aligned with the tone of the Zodiac messages. There were theories built around patterns, interpretations, and perceived connections, but like the others, it remained a theory. Compelling to some, unconvincing to others, and there were more, other names that surfaced briefly, then disappeared. People who for a moment seemed to fit, until they didn't. Because that was the pattern of this case. Every suspect explained something, but no suspect explained everything. And that difference was everything. Because in an investigation defined by fragments, partial answers were not enough. So the case continued to expand, not toward clarity, but toward uncertainty. And the question returned once again. Not who seemed possible, but who could be proven. By the time multiple suspects had been considered, a different realization began to take shape. This case was not just defined by what investigators had found, but by what they didn't. Because from the very beginning, something was missing. Pieces that should have been there simply weren't. Crime scenes that offered only fragments, partial fingerprints, unclear witness descriptions, moments captured too late or not at all. And in between those fragments, silence. The Zodiac left behind just enough to be seen, but never enough to be fully known. The letters felt personal, detailed, controlled. But even they were part of the problem, because every message raised new questions without answering the ones that mattered. And then there was the time. The late 1960s, a period where forensic technology was limited. DNA was not yet part of investigations. Data was not shared the way it is today. Different departments worked separately. Connections that might seem obvious now were easier to miss back then. And perhaps most importantly, the killer understood this. Whether by design or instinct, the Zodiac operated in the gaps, between jurisdictions, between evidence, between certainty and doubt. He did not need to disappear completely. He only needed to remain incomplete. And that is what made this case so difficult. Because investigators were not chasing a clear trail. They were chasing pieces that never fully came together. And as time passed, those missing parts didn't become clearer. They became quieter, lost in reports, buried in files, or simply never found at all. Some believed the answer was already found. Others believed it was never even close. But the Zodiac case was never just about evidence. It was about control. And the man behind the name may have understood that from the very beginning. The Zodiac was not just a name linked to violence. It was a voice, one that refused to stay silent. After the first murders, the letters began to arrive, sent to newspapers, written with intention, designed to be seen. They were not confessions in the traditional sense. They were messages, carefully constructed, each one adding something new, a detail, a threat, a piece of a larger identity. And with every letter, the case began to change. Because now, investigators were no longer just tracking a killer. They were responding to him. The Zodiac was setting the pace, choosing when to speak, choosing what to reveal, choosing how much to hide, and perhaps most importantly, choosing who would be watching. He demanded attention, threatened more violence if his messages were not published, inserted himself directly into the investigation and into the public. The ciphers made that even clearer. Symbols arranged into coded messages. Some of them would eventually be solved, fragments of meaning pulled from patterns, but others remained unsolved even decades later. And that uncertainty became part of the story, because the codes were not just puzzles, they were control, a way to hold attention, to delay answers, to stay present without being seen. And it worked. The fear spread beyond the crime scenes, into homes, into conversations, into everyday life. Because the Zodiac was no longer just someone who acted in the dark. He was someone who spoke in the open, and yet remained unknown. Which made one thing clear. This was never just about committing crimes. It was about being remembered for them. And in that sense, the Zodiac succeeded. As the years passed, the investigation began to lose momentum, not all at once, but slowly, quietly. Different departments had worked on the case from the beginning. Local police, sheriff's offices, federal agencies, each holding pieces of the same puzzle. But those pieces were not always shared. Information stayed separated. Leads were followed in isolation. Connections were missed. What could have formed a clearer picture remained divided. And over time, the case began to scatter. New leads became harder to verify. Old evidence became harder to trust. Witness memories faded, details blurred, and the urgency that once defined the investigation began to disappear. Because cases like this depend on time, and time was no longer on their side. The Zodiac had stopped writing, stopped appearing, or perhaps simply stopped being noticed. And without new activity, the case had nothing to respond to. No new direction, no clear path forward, only what had already been collected and what had already failed to lead to an answer. The investigation did not officially end, but it changed. From active to persistent, from pursuit to preservation. Files were stored, evidence was kept, but movement slowed. And with every passing year, the distance between the case and the truth grew wider. Even as the official investigation slowed, the Zodiac case never truly disappeared. It changed form, moved beyond police files and into the public. Years later, the case found a new kind of attention. Online forums, independent researchers, people who returned to the evidence again and again, looking for something that had been missed, a detail overlooked, a connection never made. And with that came new theories, new suspects, new interpretations of old clues. Some focused on patterns, others on psychology, language, geography, each one trying to rebuild the case from the outside, to see what the original investigation could not. And for a moment, some of them seemed convincing, claims supported by timelines, arguments built on fragments of evidence. But like before, none of them could answer everything, because the same problem remained: partial connections, incomplete proof, ideas that explained parts of the story, but never the whole. And still, the case continued to evolve. Advances in DNA technology brought new hope, possibilities that did not exist decades earlier. But even those efforts faced limitations. Evidence that had aged, samples that were too weak or too uncertain. And once again, the answer stayed just out of reach, which left the case in a place few investigations ever reach, not closed, not solved, but never forgotten. After decades of investigation, one question remains: not just who the Zodiac was, but why he was never found. The answer is not a single mistake or one missing clue. It is a combination of everything: the time, the limitations of the era, a case that began before modern forensic tools existed, where DNA could not be used, where data was not easily shared, where small details could be lost without being noticed. Then, the structure. Multiple agencies, separate investigations, information that did not always come together, and in between all of that, a killer who understood how to disappear without vanishing. The Zodiac did not need to be invisible. He only needed to be uncertain, to leave just enough behind to be followed, but never enough to be caught. And that created something rare, a case built on fragments, where every lead pointed somewhere, but nowhere completely. And perhaps the most difficult possibility of all is this: that the Zodiac was not extraordinary, not someone who stood out, but someone who blended in, someone who was never fully suspected, or never taken seriously enough. Because sometimes the hardest cases are not the ones with no clues, but the ones with too many directions, too many possibilities, too many ways to be wrong. And in the end, that may be what kept the truth hidden. The Zodiac case remains open, not solved, not closed, just unfinished. The letters stopped, the messages ended, but the questions never did. Who was he? How many times did he come close to being seen and simply walked away? Was he ever questioned, ever noticed? Or did he live an ordinary life, untouched by the investigation that tried to find him? There is no final answer, no moment where everything becomes clear. Only pieces, fragments that remain, and the silence between them. Because this case was never defined by a single truth. It was defined by absence, by what could not be proven, by what could not be confirmed, and over time, that absence became its own kind of answer. Not closure, but permanence. The kind that does not fade, the kind that stays. Because some stories do not end when the events stop. They continue in the questions they leave behind. And the Zodiac case is one of them. The Zodiac case ended without answers, but in another city, the questions were different, because this time, the victims were children. In Atlanta, between 1979 and 1981, something began to happen. One by one, children started to disappear. At first, it didn't seem connected, but as the numbers grew, so did the fear. Families demanded answers, communities demanded action, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge, not just in the crimes, but in how they were handled. Because this case was never only about who was responsible. It was about why it took so long to see what was happening, and what happens when a city realizes too late that something was wrong all along. Next on Catching Killers, the Atlanta child murders. Next on True Echoes. The Zodiac case ended without answers, but in another city, the questions were different, because this time, the victims were children. In Atlanta, between 1979 and 1981, something began to happen. One by one, children started to disappear. At first, it didn't seem connected, but as the numbers grew, so did the fear. Families demanded answers, communities demanded action, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge, not just in the crimes, but in how they were handled. Because this case was never only about who was responsible. It was about why it took so long to see what was happening, and what happens when a city realizes too late that something was wrong all along. Next on Catching Killers, the Atlanta child murders. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. For decades, the Zodiac case has remained unresolved, not because there were no suspects, but because none of them could be proven. And maybe that's what makes this case different. It doesn't end with an answer, it stays with a question. Who do you think the Zodiac was? Share your thoughts in the comments, because some stories don't end, they echo. Every voice matters. Subscribe and step into the echoes of truth. To be continued.